Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Admiral Gunther Lutjens and the 9-day voyage of the Battleship Bismarck. This is Part 2 of this presentation. If you have enjoyed it, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-sized biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-sized biographies. Now let's continue with our story about the battleship Bismarck. Initially euphoric over their remarkable victory over the Hood and the damage inflicted on the Prince of Wales, the crew of the Bismarck received subsequent sobering news about the condition of their own vessel. Between the Hood and the Prince of Wales, only 3 shells fired by both ships found the mark, all of these from the latter ship. 2 of these hits caused only minor damage, but the third hit the ship towards the bow and punctured several oil tanks, affecting the Bismarck's access to fuel. It also opened a hole in the hull of the ship that at full speed forced large amounts of water into the craft, building up pressure against interior bulkheads. This forced Lutjens to order a maximum speed of 28 knots, still fast, but no faster than some of the ships that might eventually pursue the Bismarck. Lutjens was also greatly agitated by another aspect of the recent engagement. It was clear to him that the British must have known of his mission shortly after it began. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for the Hood and Prince of Wales to intercept him so quickly. This also meant that other formidable ships would be in the general vicinity, and by sheer numbers alone, place both the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen in grave danger. Within hours of victory over the Hood, Lutjens decided that Operation Rheinübung was to be curtailed, and the remainder of the mission was to consist of accessing the most appropriate dry dock facility for urgently needed repairs, and as quickly as possible. Bergen, Norway did not have such a facility, but could certainly patch up the ship well enough to allow access to several dry dock options in Germany. It was also closer than coastal France, but it also meant sailing directly into the vicinity of the British Isles, Scapa Flow, and numerous ships that with even the crudest of radar systems would be able to detect and track his presence. The port of Saint-Nazaire, France, did have a substantial enough dry dock, and a southern course meant more open space to evade British pursuit, and even the possibility of a rendezvous with a German refueling tanker, a potential necessity if the oil leak proved excessive. Relatively quickly, Lutjens came to a decision. He would head to Saint-Nazaire, a successful arrival subsequent to destroying the Hood, an already substantial accomplishment. Another problem soon became evident with the ruptured bow fuel tanks leaking oil into the ocean and leaving a chemical trail that was most likely visible to pursuers as well as reconnaissance aircraft. To determine how visible this trail was, Lutjens ordered the Bismarck to cruise ahead of the Prinz Eugen for a short period, and the resulting report from Captain Brinkman was disquieting. The oil trail was so wide that it was easily visible, making the possibility of daylight evasion from British ships once they located this trail all but impossible. Lutjens also had to deal with the presence of the Prinz Eugen, which did not have the same fuel storage capacity, would soon require replenishment from a tanker. During the afternoon of the 24th, Lutjens twice attempted to facilitate the smaller German cruiser's separation from the Bismarck The first attempt failed when the weather was not unstable enough to conceal the Prinz Eugen's whereabouts, and the Suffolk was still able to track the ship, the Norfolk and Prince of Wales, focusing on the Bismarck. Lutjens canceled the separation, and the Prinz Eugen rejoined the Bismarck until another attempt was made at about 6:30 p.m., May 24th. This time, Lutjens executed a maneuver that turned his ship in the direction of his British pursuers. Only 9 miles away and well within range, he fired salvos at all 3 British ships, the Prince of Wales returning fire, but all ships halting their pursuit. During this exchange, the Prinz Eugen cruised due south at maximum speed and soon was quickly out of radar range, successfully separating from the Bismarck. The desperate determination of the British Navy was underlined on the night of the 24th, when the captain of the aircraft carrier Victorious, one of the many ships the Admiralty summoned to the vicinity of the Bismarck, took the unusual step of launching a nighttime aerial attack on the German battleship. This attack was conducted by 9 Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers. Of the 9 pilots of these planes, only 3 had ever participated in a similar operation. The others had only successfully landed on a carrier only 5 days earlier in weather that was nothing like the severe conditions in the North Atlantic. Even taking off from the carrier flight deck was challenging, but at about 11 p.m., all 9 craft struggled into the air, headed to the southwest, and hoped to locate their objective in what was left of the minimal northern latitude twilight. The sortie was led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, whose aircraft was outfitted with relatively primitive radar. So primitive, in fact, that Esmond almost attacked a U.S. Coast Guard ship, the USS Modoc, that was in the vicinity. Only the complete lack of any anti-aircraft fire and much smaller size of the ship alerted Esmond that he was about to attack the wrong vessel, and he hastily signaled his comrades to pull up. Within minutes, Esmond correctly sighted the Bismarck, and the Swordfish deployed in 3 groups of 3 planes each, all descending on the battleship in quick succession. The relatively slow speed of the practically obsolete biplanes actually played to the advantage of the attackers, as every state-of-the-art anti-aircraft weapon on the battleship came to life. The timing of the shells fired by these weapons was off, the projectiles exploding well before they reached the targeted aircraft, detonation set in anticipation of much faster planes. The rough seas and evasive maneuvers of the German ship also made accuracy difficult. All 9 Swordfish, flying only a few feet above sea level, managed to launch their torpedoes and escape unscathed, but accurately dropping a torpedo and successfully hitting a target in such conditions also posed several challenges. The weapon, upon hitting the surface of the water, could be deflected immediately off course by turbulence and high waves. The velocity of these torpedoes was also relatively slow. Quick and evasive zigzag turns executed by the German ship was enough to avoid any danger. However, one of the final attempts did manage to successfully score a direct hit on the starboard side of the Bismarck, the shockwave hurling boiler room sailors in the vicinity into bulkheads, killing at least 1 petty officer and breaking bones in several others. But the remarkable engineering and construction of the Bismarck was evidenced by the main armor belt of the ship withstanding what usually would have been a catastrophic explosion. Knowing that his group had probably scored at least 1 hit, Esmond then turned his squadron around and headed back to the Victorious. The captain of the carrier defied orders and kept searchlights on as a beacon to the planes, and despite the darkness of nightfall, all 9 Swordfish successfully returned from the mission. Although the torpedo attack had not in and of itself caused any major damage, the violent maneuvering of the ship reopened the repairs made on the bow, and water again poured into the ship, forcing Lutjens to slow down to 16 knots. Tovey was aware of the Bismarck position and reduced speed, and reasoned that it might be possible to intercept the German ship with a battle group that included the battleships Prince of Wales, King George V, and the heavy cruiser Repulse. Fuel was not only a concern for Lutjens, it was also a concern for the British, who returned to port when refueling was necessary, unlike the Germans who situated tankers throughout the Atlantic for just such an eventuality. In the early morning hours of May 25th, an incident occurred that may have been a brilliant evasive maneuver engineered by Gunther Lutjens, or merely the type of fortunate coincidence that frequently changes the course of history. Only the radar of the Suffolk was able to continuously track and inform the British fleet of the specific location of the Bismarck. On several occasions, the Suffolk briefly lost this ability, especially if the ship needed to avoid getting within range of the Bismarck's artillery. But contact was reestablished in a matter of minutes, to the extent that this situation became practically routine. To avoid U-boats, all of the British ships pursuing the Bismarck were also pursuing a sailing pattern involving a zigzag. At 3 a.m, the Suffolk lost radar contact with the German ship after the British cruiser made a southeastern motion to fulfill its evasive pattern. Fully expecting recontact in a few minutes, Captain Ellis became concerned when his radar operators were unable to do so. The situation became critical when by 5 a.m. there was no sign of the Bismarck anywhere in the vicinity. Possibly intentional, or maybe just lucky, just as the Suffolk altered course, widening the distance between the two ships, Lutjens executed a maneuver, first turning west for 30 minutes, then north for 10 minutes, and then east, heading directly for the coast of France. Effectively a large loop undetected by all of the pursuing British ships, now blindly passing to the south, assuming that the Germans were still headed in that direction. In effect, Lutjens had not only evaded his pursuers, he was now able to head towards the French coast at top speed. By 6 a.m., the alarming news that the Bismarck's location was unknown was transmitted to John Tovey, who was concerned, to say the least, coordinating a pursuit and attack on the German ship impossible if the vessel's potential whereabouts was unknown. Fuel concerns also now forced the Repulse to head back to Newfoundland, and the Prince of Wales was forced to head back to Iceland, arriving there practically on empty, with only 50 tons of fuel, the warship able to carry many thousands of tons of oil at full capacity. With the British having no idea where the Bismarck was and where she intended to sail, Lutjens then made a critical and inexplicable mistake that immediately weakened his previously strong prospects for success. He not only broke radio silence, he sent a lengthy message with an update on both the damage to his ship and his inability to shake off British pursuit. While the contents of this message would not cause him a problem, as German naval codes at that point were very difficult to decode, it was the mere length of the transmission itself that was critical. British radio receivers could establish the location of a transmitter if given a long enough message to extract a physical location. Although this calculation was a matter of interpretation, both the Home Fleet and the Admiralty began an analysis of the radio transmission in an attempt to locate the Bismarck. They reached a very different conclusion. Tovey believing that the Bismarck was heading for Norway and ultimately a German port, and the Admiralty deciding that the Bismarck was headed for France. Independent of Tovey, the battleship Rodney was ordered to attempt to intercept the Bismarck, the only ship of any consequence, close enough if the German ship was indeed headed for either of the German-occupied French ports of Brest or Saint-Nazaire. Tovey compounded his mistake by ordering his ships to search areas consistent with the route towards Norway, allowing Lutjens to open up a gap of 200 kilometers between the Bismarck and Tovey's pursuit group. It was not until dawn on May 26th that the mistake concerning the Bismarck's intent was corrected. Increased radio traffic from German outposts in France and a deciphered message to a Luftwaffe general whose son was a cadet on board the Bismarck concerning the status of the ship and its destination clearly indicated that the battleship was headed to France. While most of the British ships that had not broken off based on refueling requirements were still well behind the Bismarck, reconnaissance planes were ordered into the air to attempt to get an exact location of the German vessel. One of these planes was a Catalina seaplane, captained by Lieutenant Dennis Briggs, which took off during the early daylight hours of May 26th from Northern Ireland. However, weather conditions were terrible, the plane having to change direction several times to avoid severe storms. Because the Catalina was a relatively new aircraft built and provided by the United States, Briggs was accompanied by an American named Tuck Smith, who was acting as both an advisor and a pilot of a plane that could stay in the air for up to 28 hours. This secret assignment, if known publicly, would have been quite controversial, as America was officially still a neutral country. Nevertheless, 4.5 hours into their flight, and having just arrived into the southwestern area where it was believed that the Bismarck might be headed, the clouds parted, and both pilots were able to observe an unusually large warship on the horizon. Although Smith intended to get a better look and tried to get closer using cloud cover, he emerged into clear skies, practically on top of the warship, which left no doubt as to its identity by unleashing a fierce barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The Catalina narrowly escaped being shot down, several pieces of shrapnel penetrating the plane, but Smith applied evasive maneuvers and successfully disappeared back into the clouds. Briggs then sent a brief but crucial message: a battleship sighted, bearing 240 degrees. It then gave the Catalina's exact position and concluded 10:30 hours, May 26th. The Bismarck's location was no longer unknown. Some quick calculations indicated that only a small number of British ships were potentially able to intercept the Bismarck. These included a battle group commanded by Captain Somerville, consisting of the battlecruiser Renown, cruiser Sheffield, and aircraft carrier Ark Royal, currently stationed about 150 miles to the east of the Bismarck, between the German ship and its French destination. Unfortunately, none of these ships could compete with the Bismarck's firepower. The main potential for attack was Ark Royal's contingent of Swordfish torpedo bombers. A contingent of destroyers also in the vicinity of the Bismarck and escorting merchant convoys broke off and joined the pursuit as well. But realistically, the only hope of stopping or even damaging the German warship was an aerial torpedo attack. Even launching such an attack in rough seas and bad weather would be challenging, but the mission was scheduled to begin at 1500 hours in any case. 15 Swordfish, all equipped with radar, quickly spotted a ship that in the rain appeared to be the Bismarck. Only in the midst of the attack did some of the pilots realize that it was actually the British cruiser Sheffield, which was moving as fast as possible to attempt to track the Bismarck from a safe distance. Luckily, the ship was able to evade any torpedoes. Others exploded upon impact on the surface of the ocean, another negative of attempting to use such weapons in rough seas. The Swordfish all returned to the Ark Royal, where Somerville chose to omit any details of the mistake, only issuing a communique that the 3 o'clock sortie failed to hit the Bismarck. He immediately ordered another attack at 1900 hours. This time, the aircraft would be aided by a homing signal from the Sheffield, meant as a navigational aid, but would also serve as a precaution to avoid another dive-bombing mistake. By 1700, the Sheffield had closed to within 10 nautical miles of the Bismarck and could provide an exact position once the Swordfish reached the British cruiser's position. It took about an hour for the torpedo bombers to reach the Sheffield. Once there, they received information about the Bismarck's location. The weather remained dreadful, with rain showers and a low cloud ceiling restricting visibility. The squadron of bombers was ordered to attack on their own, the target only visible from an altitude of about 700 feet. It was almost 2100 hours. The high waves also added the additional impediment of having to time dropping the torpedoes in between the crest of the waves. A torpedo hitting the crest would have its trajectory altered like a rock skipping on the surface of the water. Some of the Bismarck's guns fired into the water as an attempt to deflect as many torpedoes as possible. Whether this tactic worked cannot be determined. Planes began their run at a distance of about 4,000 feet and an altitude of 700 feet, dodging heavy anti-aircraft fire for the duration and even after passing over the ship. Between the shells landing in the water, smoke from the Bismarck's guns, and the generally poor visibility in wet weather, it was impossible to tell if any of the torpedoes found the mark. Once all 15 biplanes completed their bombing runs, the commander of the mission, Albert Cootie, circled the vicinity of the ship several times to determine if any damage had occurred. He saw none and radioed back to the Ark Royal that he estimated 0 hits on the Bismarck. When this report reached Tovey and other officers on the King George V, the bleak realization that the Bismarck had escaped and their pursuit had failed was greeted with silent despair. Within 24 to 48 hours, the Bismarck would reach the air cover of the Luftwaffe and additional protection from German coastal naval assets. But Cootie's assessment was premature. The Swordfish had a 3-man crew, a pilot, gunner, and an observer, and at least one of these observers was certain that a torpedo hit the Bismarck's port side. But that was not as effectual as another torpedo strike that was a direct hit on the stern of the ship. Sailors on the Bismarck described a huge geyser shooting up from the rear of the craft, a shudder reverberating throughout the vessel, strong enough to force the crew to hold on, the ship beginning to seriously list to starboard. Lindemann reduced speed and the ship regained stability, but he could not regain control of the damaged steering mechanism, the rudders of the ship now jammed into a permanent position that had the ship set on a course back into the direction of its British pursuers. It was also impossible to access the damaged area. The compartments near the rudder also filled with seawater that rocked violently, the sea approaching gale force volatility. Divers were sent down to attempt repairs. Again, the water was too turbulent to even attempt to fix. So desperate was the situation that detonating explosives and destroying the rudder mechanism entirely was considered. But discarded, such an explosion might also damage the propellers, rendering the ship completely helpless. By midnight of the 27th of May, Tovey had pieced together enough information to at least sense that something catastrophic had occurred on the Bismarck. The ship seen traveling unusually slowly and 2 successive circles by observation Swordfish sent from the Ark Royal subsequent to the torpedo attack. But instead of ordering some form of piecemeal immediate attack, he organized his ships so that the escape to France was cut off, and the maximum number of ships with suitable firepower, in this case the battleships Rodney and King George V, could be brought to bear. Further indications that the Bismarck had lost control occurred when the Sheffield, attempting to track the Bismarck, suddenly observed the ship not only heading directly at the Sheffield, but presenting the entire ship as a target as opposed to posing a much narrower target. The Bismarck fired several salvos that came close to hitting the Sheffield, which quickly withdrew behind fog and a smoke screen and out of danger, but the ship's commander was able to observe the Bismarck heading northwest in a direction that was directly at Tovey's battle group and completely away from its previous heading towards France and escape. Soon the Bismarck also appeared in the vicinity of the destroyer unit commanded by Captain Vian. For the rest of the night, the squadron of 5 ships attempted to harass the German vessel with torpedo attacks while avoiding artillery fire. Although this attack did not score any hits, Vian was able to observe the exact location of the battleship as it continued to head in the wrong direction, again directly at the much more formidable Tovey group. By now, on board the Bismarck, Lutjens had already accepted that there was little that he could do to change the situation. He radioed naval headquarters in France that his ship was not maneuverable, and then sent a less than optimistic message directly to Adolf Hitler. "We will fight to the last in our faith in you, mein Führer, and in our unshakable trust in Germany's victory." Hitler responded, "All of Germany is with you. What can be done will be done. Your devotion to duty will strengthen our nation and its struggle for its existence. Adolf Hitler." These and other messages, as well as operational updates, were transmitted to the crew, meant as a morale booster, but they had the opposite effect. the crew perceiving that the ship had already been written off as doomed. As dawn broke on May 27th, a general feeling of foreboding swept the Bismarck. So convinced of what the future held, Lutjens ordered that the ship's diary and film footage of the ship's voyage be packed onto the Bismarck's Oredo seaplane and flown to France. The two fortunate pilots assigned to this task also shoved many cards and letters into their uniforms, potentially the last communications that some of the crew's loved ones might ever receive. But even this mission was canceled when the compressed gas-propelled device used to launch the Oredo was found to have been irreparably damaged. At approximately 8:45, several British ships spotted the Bismarck about 12 miles away, the Rodney and King George V, opening fire. Lindemann alternated his propeller speeds to move as evasively as he could, and the Bismarck fired back at the Rodney. But two battleships had now maneuvered into a position allowing for all of their guns to be utilized. At 8:59, Rodney scored the first hit at a distance of 10 miles, disabling the Bismarck's sophisticated gun sighting mechanism. The Bismarck had backup systems in place, but these would take time to implement, and accuracy suffered in any case. 3 minutes later, Rodney again scored with a direct hit on the Bismarck's front B turret, knocking it out of action and effectively silencing the A turret for most of the rest of the battle. The two battleships then joined by the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire, who commenced firing with its own 8-inch guns, the dangerous firepower from the Bismarck now greatly reduced. The German ship was also hampered by its inability to meaningfully maneuver, as its British counterparts maintained optimal firing positions. By 9:25, both rear turrets were disabled, the German warship now essentially defenseless. The British ships closed to within 2 miles and continued to pound away, the armored hull withstanding the assault and keeping the vessel afloat. The Bismarck's deck was transformed into a fiery hulk of bent steel and wrecked equipment. At 10:15, Tovey ordered all ships to cease fire and sent the Dorsetshire in an attempt to sink the Bismarck with torpedoes. The order to abandon ship had been given, Gunther Lutjens and Ernst Lindemann already dead, the bridge of the ship having received several direct hits. At 10:24, the Dorsetshire fired 4 torpedoes into the burning wreck, which slowly began to sink. The giant ship began to list severely to its port side and then capsized, the 4 turrets so severely damaged that they fell off into the water, held in place only by gravity. Whether this end was due to torpedoes or the Bismarck's crew scuttling the ship became a matter of dispute, but the fate of Nazi Germany's unsinkable ship was now clear as, at 10:40 a.m., May 27th, it sank beneath the waves. As the ship sank, inflatable rafts were thrown overboard, crew members jumping in after them. Large numbers of men had already been killed, shrapnel from the incessant bombardment sweeping any open areas with fatal consequences. Unlike the Hood, which sank in a matter of minutes, the crew of the Bismarck was subjected to a lengthy bombardment, which inflicted the horrifying result of bodies, body parts, limbs, and pools of blood throughout the ship. Abandoning ship was difficult enough, but once anyone fortunate enough to make it off of the ship alive entered the oily, freezing cold water, they faced the challenge of hypothermia and suction from the sinking Bismarck. A very fortunate few crew members were able to take advantage of the beneficence of the Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori, who compassionately entered the chaos to attempt to rescue survivors. Most of these survivors were hauled onto both ships by lines tossed into the water, but some Germans were so exhausted they were unable to hang on or even grab the extended ropes, these unfortunates drowning within sight of deliverance. After about 100 German crew members were pulled out of the water, a lookout observed what he thought was a periscope and puff of smoke from a U-boat in the vicinity. This update transmitted to the Dorsetshire's captain, Martin. Agonizing for a few minutes, he then gave the order to break off the rescue and leave the vicinity, despite hundreds of Germans still in the water. A U-boat did eventually arrive on the scene a few hours later, as German submarines were ordered to the vicinity of the final battle. This vessel, U-74, did rescue 3 men in a raft. And over 2 days after the Bismarck sank, 2 more men were rescued by a German weather observation ship. But that was it. Of the original crew of over 2,200 men, only 114 survived. The Prinz Eugen did manage to escape to the French port of Brest, arriving on June 1st. However, the loss of the Bismarck was a devastating blow to German morale and military prestige, although sinking the Hood was initially also a painful loss for the British Navy. Their ability to respond, despite the unlikely success of the Swordfish mission that made the difference, reassured the British people that Britannia still ruled the waves. For the German Navy at its highest levels, the loss of the Bismarck proved a highly troublesome outcome. In early June, summoned to a personal meeting with Adolf Hitler, Erich Raeder was pummeled with a harangue of questions that only underlined the Führer's lack of confidence in the entire surface battleship warfare concept itself. This after the Graf Spee, the second major battleship failure of the war. Only Hitler's obsessive focus on the impending attack on the Soviet Union stopped him from any radical decisions regarding either Raeder or the German Navy. The German admiral's reprieve lasted until late December 1942, when another failure to block convoy traffic despite the presence of 2 German heavy cruisers, including the Lutjens, prompted Hitler to demote Raeder to a ceremonial position and give naval operational responsibilities to Karl Dönitz, with an emphasis on the U-boat warfare that had been quite successful in sinking the majority of Allied tonnage lost during the war. Hitler would be so angry at what he considered to be the long-term failure of Raeder that he initially ordered all of the German capital vessels scrapped for the construction of other weapons, but Dönitz convinced him that these ships did have a defensive purpose. However, all of the larger German battleships, including the Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, and Tirpitz, would be sunk or destroyed before the end of the war. Nevertheless, Dönitz would be held in such high esteem by Hitler for his U-boat accomplishments and loyalty that just prior to his suicide, Hitler named him as his political successor in the closing days of World War II. Both Dönitz and Raeder were tried as major defendants at Nuremberg. Raeder received a life sentence, and Dönitz a sentence of 10 years, surprising in that Dönitz's U-boats caused far more death and destruction than the mostly ineffectual German Navy. However, the belief at the time was that Raeder had been a major architect of the German military and a greater role in the events that led up to World War II, whereas Dönitz was essentially a soldier who carried out operations that were similar to the Allies. Both men were released from Spandau prison in 1955, Dönitz after serving his 10-year sentence, Raeder for reasons due to both health and more likely due to a newfound belief that his sentence had been excessive. The wreck of the Bismarck has been located and explored by several underwater expeditions. Examination of the ship's hull indicated that it sank as a result of both damage from British shelling and explosive scuttling charges placed by German crew members in their final moments on board. Regardless of who eventually received historical credit, at the time, the sinking of the Bismarck was a major victory for Great Britain and one of several pivotal moments that began to change the course of World War II. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about the Battleship Bismarck. Information for this podcast came from the books The Bismarck, 1941, Hunting Germany's Greatest Battleship by Angus Constam, and Bismarck, The Final Days of Germany's Greatest Battleship by Nicholas Zetterling. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.